Edmonton is the capital city of the province of Alberta, situated on the North Saskatchewan River. With a city population of over 1 million and a metropolitan population of 1.5 million, this makes Edmonton the 5th largest city and the 6th largest metropolitan area in Canada. Known as the Gateway to the North, the city is a staging point for large-scale oil sands projects occurring in northern Alberta and large-scale diamond mining operations in the Northwest Territories. Edmonton is no stranger to prolific murderers, but a lesser-known serial murderer to those outside Edmonton is Thomas Svekla. His crimes were compared to that of Robert Pickton. Prostitutes had been disappearing in northern Alberta since 1988. Their mutilated and decomposing bodies turned up repeatedly in fields on the east edge of the city. A special task force was set up, and in June of 2004, police announced that they were looking for a serial killer. Although he was suspected of killing as many as 12 women, he was only ever charged with the murders of 2. This is the story of Thomas Svekla. In Thomas's eyes, he was as much of a victim as his victims were. His childhood was one filled with horrific abuse. Although even his own lawyer, Robert Pickton, had characterized Svekla as a weird and strange liar. However, destructive behavior did appear to run in the Svekla family. Tom's grandfather shot himself in the head in a granary. His grandmother was once arrested for selling moonshine. His father's 2 other brothers died as a result of chronic drinking, and another uncle who ran a grow-up killed himself by driving drunk and hitting a train. Tom Svekla was born in Vegreville in April of 1968 and was the last of 7 children. With 6 older sisters, he was the only son of George and Emily Svekla. When asked about his family after he was arrested in 2006, he said, quote, "We are a very proud family. They tried 6 times before they had a son. They wanted me to carry on the name Svekla, and look at how I'm doing it." At least he has a sense of humor about it, no matter how dark and twisted it might be. Svekla's over-the-top description of his life began with his earliest memories. Apparently, when he was only 3 years old, he got lost on the family farm just outside of Vegreville, only to be pushed home by a massive bull. Remember I mentioned earlier that his lies were a little weird. As a child, Tom was coddled by his mother and bullied by his father. Tom said in an interview with the Edmonton Journal that he didn't know rules growing up. Just chaos and fear of his father with no escape. Later, after his arrest, when he was being interviewed by the police, Svekla would talk non-stop about his father. He referred to his father as, quote, "Big bad old George Svekla," and said that George was an abusive alcoholic and claimed that everybody was still afraid of him, even though now he was old and weak, and that 50 years later his parents were still fighting. In the 1970s, George Svekla took over the family farm just outside of Vegreville, but lost it in 1975 as a result of his drinking. For a short time afterwards, the family rented the farm, and then they moved to the town of Fort Saskatchewan. It was here things went from bad to worse. The abuse escalated, and in 1980, Emily Svekla petitioned the court to divorce from George. In her affidavit, Emily alleged her husband once threw chairs at her and kicked her in the back with steel-toed boots, after which she required surgery. A few months later, Emily alleged George again kicked her in the back, despite her recent back surgery. She also claimed that he severely beat his children, striking them with belt buckles, kicking them so hard they required surgery, choking them, and hitting them in the face until they were covered with blood. Emily would back up these statements years later when Tom was arrested and would be presented as evidence at his trial. She said George was an alcoholic who later quit drinking, but became addicted to prescription medication instead, substituting one addiction for another. After she left, though, Emily said that George kept stalking her and the people she worked with and their mutual friends in order to find out where she was living. In her court papers, she said she was afraid for her own life and safety. Tom would later say that he didn't have any good memories of his father because he would always drink too much and make a scene, but said that he forgives his father, saying, quote, "He did the best he could. He didn't have good parents. How was he to know what good parents do?" In the end, even though George was a mean and angry drunk, Emily didn't divorce him due to money issues and went back to him. At the time, she was working part-time at a nursing home, only making $210 a month. The two moved into a home outside of Fort Saskatchewan, and George went back to drinking. In Thomas's words, he said, quote, "Mom, me, and my older sister were trapped living in the country." Even though George was a despicable person, some family members felt that Emily was too forgiving with Tom. His sister Donna said that their mother constantly focused on Tommy and dropped everything when he needed something. For the most part, Tom was left to his own devices growing up because his mother worked. At the same time, his mother was overly protective and also wanted him to stay at home to protect her from George. She spoiled him frequently. He could pretty much do anything and she would just say, "Tom, it's all right. You know God is with you." But Tom liked to blame everyone for his problems. His father, mother, ex-girlfriend, and 6 sisters, because they rejected him and didn't love him. Because of all the turmoil at home, Svekla spent a lot of time outdoors and came to love life out in the countryside. And because he was a big kid, he was able to hang out with an older crowd and would spend hours driving around the countryside in an ATV. Svekla started to work on cars when he was 14 years old. He was a good worker, but had issues with authority, saying he didn't like his bosses in the way while he worked because he didn't want any distractions. Svekla's work as a mechanic was a good fit for his other career as a thief. He stole gas and cars and made friends at a chop shop. And he used the money from the sale of stolen goods to help him fuel his drug addiction. When his father took early retirement, the family had to sell the property in the country and move into Fort Saskatchewan. This is around the time Tom claims he started drinking heavily, apparently because of the loss of freedom he had in the country. He graduated from high school in 1987 and soon had a close girlfriend referred to in court records as S. Her name is protected because of a publication ban. According to Tom, their relationship ended because he was too close to his mother and felt guilty leaving her alone at home with George. But S testified at his trial that their relationship ended in 1990 after he choked her in a parking lot and jammed his forearm into her throat until she could no longer breathe. One night at the age of 17, Tom Svekla knocked on the door of a friend's house asking for someone to let him in. His hand was bloodied up, and a teenage girl, who will refer to as Jay due to a publication ban, invited him in. She took Svekla into the bathroom to help him clean the wound on his hand, saying that he had swung his fist through a window during a fist fight. She went to get some bandages from the kitchen, and then the mask came off. Out of nowhere, he started blaming Jay for the fight, yelling at her, chasing her down the hall, and throwing her on the floor. He attempted to sexually assault her, but she begged him not to, telling him that others would be home soon. This seemed to work. He stopped, but promised to kill her if she ever told anyone. She was so terrified that he would return that after he left, she ran outside and hid in a barn. Jay would quickly forgive Svekla. He blamed his attack on her on his booze and drug use, although Tom never considered himself to be an alcoholic or an angry drunk. 20 years later, when he was charged with murder, an old friend came to visit Tom in jail. He asked her to take a message to Jay. Quote, "I need you to tell her that she was the first one. She was the first one I ever hurt. She was the first one to see the boogeyman." In 1993, Tom would be convicted of drinking and driving, property theft, and assaulting a prostitute in downtown Edmonton. He apparently tried to steal her purse, but she chased after him and jumped into the back of his pickup truck. He sped around a corner, and she flew out the back. In 1995, Svekla began dating an ambitious woman named M. I'm sorry for all the annoying euphemisms, but publication bans are publication bans, and there's a big reason for this one. According to M, Tom was not a very nice man. He liked to be the life of the party, but could flip on a dime and could get violent quickly. In the beginning, he portrayed himself as honest and caring. He lied to her and told her he was employed, when really he was getting by stealing, fixing up, and selling cars. M had just gotten out of a bad marriage and had 2 children, a daughter and a son, as well as 2 foster children. And she could see that Tom had little to no patience with the kids. She decided that the 2 foster children should live elsewhere. On the day they left, M was emotional and cried, which for whatever reason made Svekla angry. He said to her, quote, "I don't think I want to live with some miserable little bitch." Okay, that should have been her sign to run. But instead, she and Svekla decided to move away from Edmonton to a smaller Alberta town. Just before they left, Svekla became violent with M. They were planning a garage sale, but Tom took off one night and got drunk. The next day, he was hungover, and M asked him to put up signs around the town for the sale. He went to do it, but forgot the staple gun, blaming M for not reminding him to take it with him. He was still drunk from his bender and punched her, knocking out her front tooth. But the 2 patched things up, leaving Edmonton as planned, and he credited M with helping him separate himself from his mother. After the move, he started to improve a bit. He got his license and insurance so he could drive legally, and cut down on his drinking. For several years, he worked at a gravel trenching company, but he still had rage issues. He got fired from one job after arguing with the owner's son and ripping the shirt off his back. In 1998, M and Svekla had a son together, but he was an inattentive father. In one incident, he walked into the store where M worked and picked up a small boy and started to kiss it. The child's real mother started to freak out. In reality, his own son was sleeping in the back of the store. His excuse was that the kid was bundled up in winter clothing and he was tired from work and made a mistake. But in 1990, M received some alarming news that the police were investigating Tom for sexual assault. One of M's foster children, a little girl, claimed that Svekla had abused her. The police paid him a visit, but he was never charged. His story was that the little girl had been previously abused and was very clingy, which made both him and M uncomfortable and led to M returning the children to social services. In the end, M chose to believe her husband that the allegations were false. But the strain in their marriage grew. Tom was also extremely verbally abusive. He never addressed her by her name. She was always the stupid bitch or the fat bitch. And Tom, of course, blamed M for his behavior, saying it was true that he called her names, but said M was like his dad, that Tom was never good enough. In the meantime, M was becoming isolated from her old friends. At the time, Tom kicked her and hit her. And after one horrible fight, where Svekla sat on top of her and beat her, he ran into the living room, had a meltdown, grabbed the couple's young son, held him tightly, and whined, "I'm trying my best." He loved feeling sorry for himself and trying to convince others that he was the victim, and didn't have to be accountable for anything wrong he did in his life. His marriage to M eventually came to an end in 1999, when he was charged with the sexual assault of a minor, M's own 9-year-old daughter. How many times this occurred is not fully known, but he has at least one conviction, and has admitted to offenses with at least 2 girls who were not of age. And his confessions about the assaults are all over the place. He tried to make it about him, saying he felt trapped, once again making himself to be the victim, and he couldn't talk to anyone about it, and that M called him the P word, which he was, In his eyes, he was stuck and he couldn't get help. After he was arrested, Svekla confessed to the police. While preparing for court, he was interviewed by Dr. Marguerite Paulson, who afterwards wrote a letter to the court saying he was a good candidate for therapy and rehabilitation. When I get closer to the end of this story, you'll see why I feel this way, but given what I know, this doctor should seriously consider a new profession. She couldn't have been more wrong. At Svekla's trial, Judge J.R. McIntosh didn't agree with the doctor's position. It didn't seem like Tom was taking full responsibility for his actions. M had given him a chance to stop his behavior, but he continued to do it, and the judge noted that there was more than one incident. Svekla, always the victim, took the position that it wasn't his fault. It was M's fault for not protecting her daughter. Dr. Marguerite Paulson actually wrote in her report that the subject informed her that his wife had called him a pedophile, and this hurt him deeply, as he does not consider or feel like a pedophile. The judge was not amused, and told Svekla and his lawyer, quote, "I do not know how a pedophile feels, but an adult who performs sexual acts on a 9-year-old falls within the definition." He also said that the subject describes himself as a good father, while a good father does not do what this guy has admitted to doing. In the meantime, Tom's parents were in denial. They refused to believe he had any problems and thought that he was arrested on trumped-up charges. They also thought that he was tricked into confessing. In the end, Svekla was sentenced to 30 months in jail for abusing his stepdaughter. Although, despite his conviction, he was working out a plan to try and win back M. He told her 2 teachers in his past sexually abused him. This time, she saw through his manipulation. It was a made-up story so that people would feel sorry for him for what he did to his stepdaughter. She filed for divorce in 2000 and also sought a restraining order against Svekla and 10 members of his family. While he was in jail, he refused to sign the divorce papers and also requested visitation rights with his son. But his ex-wife objected and was eventually awarded full custody. While he was in prison, he joined AA and programs for sex offenders, family violence, and stress management. He also worked as a prison mechanic. And in October of 2001, Tom was granted a conditional release and went to live in a halfway house. The conditions being he had to abstain from pornography, drugs, and alcohol. In September of 2002, around the same time Svekla completed the terms of his sentence, a new RCMP task force was created to investigate the deaths of sex trade workers in the Edmonton area. 10 sex workers had been killed in the area in the past 14 years, and their bodies were all found in rural areas to the south or east of the city. 10 of the cases were sent to analysts at the RCMP Behavioral Science Unit in Ottawa. Their conclusion was that 5 of the killings were probably committed by the same offender. Monique Petra, age 30, and Melissa Munch, age 20, were both found near Sherwood Park only 5 days apart and within 5 kilometers of each other. In both cases, neither women were reported as missing. Monique was described as a girly girl. Her friends say her hair and makeup was always perfect. Originally from Toronto, where she worked as a waitress, a friend convinced Monique to move to Edmonton in 1996. Shortly after the move, she fell into a drug addiction and turned to prostitution to support her habit. Melissa Munch had moved from Calgary to Edmonton in 2002 to start a new life. But 6 months later, her body would be discovered in Sherwood Park by a man walking his dog. On April 27, 2003, Katie Ballantyne told her friend Jack Perrault that she would be right back when she left his home to work the streets. On July 7, 2003, her remains were found in a field east of Leduc. Edna Bernard was a 28-year-old mother of 6. She was last seen being dropped off near 118th Avenue and 95th Street. 4 hours later, her burnt body was found in a wooded area outside of Leduc. On the morning of November 4, 2002, Debbie Lake had left her home to find a payphone to call a friend. She left behind her cigarettes and her 10-month-old child. Her husband reported her missing the next day. 6 months later, a man looking for deer antlers near Camrose found a skull. DNA tests confirmed it was Debbie. The rest of her remains were never found. In 2003, the RCMP established Project KARE, a joint Alberta RCMP and Edmonton City Police task force, to investigate dozens of unsolved homicides and missing person cases of people who lived what police called high-risk lifestyles. They were jointly working on the cases of 26 people who had died, the earliest case being 1975, and also said that a serial killer may be responsible for some of them. The police also worked with Edmonton sex trade workers and encouraged them to provide DNA samples. More than 400 sex trade workers registered with Project KARE to spare their families the anguish of uncertainty should they suddenly disappear. Rachel Quinney, aged 20, was a mother of 2. Her body was discovered on June 11, 2004, in a small grove of trees near a rural intersection. Charlene Gaulds struggled with addiction from the age of 15 and started working as a sex worker to support her habit. However, her family never gave up on her, even going so far as putting sensors on the doors and windows so they knew if their daughter tried to leave the house. In February of 2004, Charlene registered with Project KARE, providing her name, date of birth, next of kin, identifying marks, and hair samples for DNA purposes. She was last seen on April 8, 2005, and would be reported missing on April 13th. Her body was found a few days later, 60 kilometers outside of Edmonton, near Camrose. Both Rachel Quinney and Charlene Gauld were later linked to the first 5 murders through similar circumstances. It's not known what circumstances the police are referring to, but there was speculation that they were similar to the Quinney case, where the murderer cut off the victim's breasts and genitalia and dumped the body in the brush, just off a country road. In 2004, Project KARE later added the names of Corey Ottenbright and Maggie Burke. Both women worked 118th Avenue and 95th Street, the same area where Charlene Gauld worked. Dolores Brower was last seen by Project KARE on 118th and 70th Avenue on May 13, 2004. 1 year later, her family reported her as missing. And in 2005, Theresa Innes and Bonnie Jack were also added to the list of homicides with similar characteristics. The bodies of Corey Ottenbright and Dolores Brower would not be discovered until 2015, almost 9 years later. And Burke's remains have never been found. And an older 1989 case, the murder of Bernadette Ahenakew, was also flagged to being similar to the original 5. In February of 2002, Svekla was still being held at the Stan Daniels Healing Center, a halfway house in Edmonton. He would eventually place an ad for a roommate, and then went back to trying to win M back. When he failed, he started calling her up regularly to brag about the other women he was meeting. M was afraid of him, but felt it was best for her son to keep the lines of communication open with his father. Svekla's roommate eventually moved out, leaving him alone in the home. He converted the roommate's old room into a rigged-up special room in the unfinished basement, partitioning it off with black shower curtains hanging from copper tubing along the ceiling and attached to the floor with rubber tubing. Inside this makeshift room was a carpet, a dresser, a TV, VCR, and inflatable double mattress. He made the room, he said, because it was too hot to sleep upstairs. He once showed the room to his sister Donna, who would later testify at his trial about it. She said her brother boasted he took his sexual conquests to the room. Quote, "They were complaining about too much noise, but they can scream all they want down here. No one can hear them scream." He then slapped the mattress and laughed. Svekla also was seeing a new woman named Kay. a mother of 2 young children. Kay was vulnerable. She was in the middle of a breakup of a long-term relationship. Looking back at that time, Kay now believes she was targeted. They met at Edmonton's Ford dealership, where Svekla worked as a mechanic and Kay took her car to be serviced. They dated for a while, but Kay never moved in with Svekla, mainly because of one unsettling matter, and that was Svekla's relationship with an underage neighbor. To Kay, it seemed like Svekla preferred the company of the little girl, and it creeped her out. She ended up calling Svekla's ex-wife, who told her about his past convictions. Kay confronted Tom, telling him he had an obligation to inform others that he was a convicted pedophile. He apologized, but said that he was testing himself to see if he could hang out with young children and control previous urges. And surprisingly, Kay continued to date Svekla. But after a few weeks, he began opening up to her, telling her that he was testing the neighborhood kids and that he still had these urges. He also told her about the previous children he assaulted, including M's foster daughter. And I'm not going to go into graphic detail of what he said to her because his words were disgusting as far as I'm concerned. But in a nutshell, he pretty much blamed the children for his previous actions. He was the real victim. Kay, of course, was appalled, and she didn't hold back. Quote, "I played therapist to him, trying to figure him out, and then I just got sick of it. He just had no social norms. He was just too far gone." Around this time, Tom was starting to have problems on the job. But if he ever failed, or was up too late the night before, or bumped his head at work, he blamed Kay. He was just completely self-absorbed. As his relationship with Kay began to fall apart, he began going out with more and more prostitutes. In late fall of 2003, Svekla spent a lot of time with one particular sex worker, a young native woman named Kimberly. She was addicted to crack cocaine and lived in the 118th Avenue area. When Kimberly was out with another drug dealer one night, she accidentally overdosed and died. After her death, Svekla found some crack cocaine in her belongings. He wondered what the drug was all about and decided to try it. He was hooked immediately. In December of 2003, Kay found out about Svekla's drug use and his relationships with prostitutes. She had contracted gonorrhea from Svekla. Finally, Kay was done with him and she broke things off for good. In 2004, he went through numerous jobs but didn't hold one down for very long. He was far too erratic to do good work for any extended period of time. He ended up as a drug runner and a thief. Svekla would be up all hours of the night, smoking drugs and partying, often with sex workers, and his cocaine use was increasing. He and his new girlfriends used counterfeit money to buy drugs, but he mainly funded his habit through theft. One dealer gave him a list of everyday things he wanted: food, clothing, and liquor, and Svekla was to fill the list, and then barter the stolen items for drugs. He would wear baggy clothing into a liquor store, and then stuff 60-ounce bottles down each leg, and 40-ounce bottles under each arm, and then head out the door. He would roll expensive suits under his arms, and then take off with his girlfriend who was waiting for him in the getaway car. One day each month, he had to fill an order for a local restaurant, who wanted 200 racks of lamb. Svekla would head off to a grocery store, stuffing lamb into his jacket and into special spandex underwear he had on. Once an in-store detective spotted him and gave chase, but Svekla managed to escape, with racks of lamb flying out of his pants and jacket as he ran. Svekla also stole cars, mainly from a lot of fitness clubs. He would see someone drive up in a car that he wanted, usually a luxury model. He would follow that person into the club, pay to get himself in, watch the guy change into his gym clothes, and then use bolt cutters to break into his locker. Eventually, he would be caught trying to steal a silverware set in April 2004 and was arrested for robbery. He would plead guilty in May of that year, and was handed a fine of $250 and a warning from the judge to stay away from drug dealers. But of course, he didn't listen. If anything, his crime started to escalate. He moved into an apartment near West Edmonton Mall and kept on robbing, smoking crack, and bringing home different girls each night. Then in June 2004, Svekla showed up at his sister Donna's house at 7 a.m. According to Donna, Tom was nervous, crying, and distraught. His appearance was clean. He apparently looked like he had just gotten out of the shower, but his forearms were covered in scratches. He said the marks came from a cat. He told Donna he had done something very bad, and he had to get rid of his car, although he wouldn't say exactly why. He just kept repeating, quote, "I did a bad thing, I did a bad thing. Everyone is going to hate me." A few days later, he came to the attention of Project KARE. It was Donna who pressed him to go to the police, after he told her a story about how he had been out in a truck in the countryside, smoking crack with a sex worker. He got out of the vehicle and found the body of a dead woman in a clump of trees. It was simply rotten luck on his part. Svekla would lead the RCMP to the body, soon identified as that of Rachel Quinney. She was about 17 when she started working as a sex worker at the corner of 118th Avenue and 86th Street. She started referring to herself as Candace and was only 19 when she was murdered. The circumstances of Quinney's discovery were suspicious to investigators. Svekla agreed to be interviewed, give DNA, and to take a polygraph, although his results were marked as inconclusive. And then Tom did what he always did, point the finger at someone else. He told Sergeant Jim Gamelin, who was the polygraph examiner, that he felt harassed and humiliated by the Project KARE investigation, and also feared that he could go to jail. He also speculated with Gamelin on the nature of the Edmonton serial killer, and admitted himself that he fit the profile, saying that the killer had a mean, controlling mother, and that his ex-wife was like this too. M was mean to him and victimized him and called him a pedophile. Svekla then described how the killer had dumped Rachel in long grass, but didn't try to cover the body or conceal it. And Gamelin asked him, what could the killer be saying? And Svekla replied that he thinks no one really cares about hookers or prostitutes or people who use crack cocaine. He only cares about himself, right? He doesn't care about others. He thinks he's helping the community by getting rid of these girls. About the same time as the RCMP were investigating him, a stressed-out Svekla called up Kay. He was in a foul mood and began threatening her, saying that he knew where she worked and that he knew she moved around, but he could always find her and kill her and no one would find her body. Kay let him have it and called him a crack whore, and then called the police and her brother, who promptly called Svekla and told him to leave her alone or face serious consequences. Svekla was becoming obsessed with the Quinney investigation. He would tell the story of him finding her body to more than a dozen people in the following months, each version a little different than the last. And his crack addiction continued and began to spin out of control. In November of 2004, he was involved in another DUI case. This time he smashed 3 parked cars while trying to outrun the police. He tried to get clean and went to 2 different drug rehab facilities but failed at both. His last attempt to go to rehab, and the only spot available, was at the Action North Treatment Center in High Level. And this is where things took a turn from bad to worse. Svekla didn't do well at the Action North Rehab. He was expelled for drinking, and one female resident had also complained that he was peeking through her window. He was no longer able to pass himself off as a normal person. He became associated with addicts, petty criminals, and sex workers who lived on the street in the worst areas of northern Alberta. And he started using crack again, living in a shabby rooming house before moving into a rundown apartment. He took a job at Fountain Tire and worked there from June 2005 to February of 2006. But he wasn't well liked by other employees. They saw him as moody, And he also bragged about his many girlfriends, and they had to tell him that they just didn't want to hear his stories. Almost all of Svekla's girlfriends were from the streets, and at one point he had 13 women living with him. He gave them money for cigarettes and alcohol, and the women cleaned his house and did his laundry and had sex with him. And whenever he went into town, he hit on women, whether his interest was appreciated or not. On August 4th, 2005, Svekla met a woman named V. He invited her to his place for a drink, but when she got there, he asked her if she wanted to smoke crack. V didn't do drugs. Svekla offered V a beer, and then started clearing off his bed. She became extremely uncomfortable, so she announced she had to leave. Out of nowhere, Svekla grabbed her and started choking her. She struggled until she was weak, but went limp, deciding to play dead. Somehow, when he wasn't paying attention, she found the strength to get up and run. Svekla, of course, denied that this ever happened, and said that she was already drunk and wanted a place to drink. In the fall of 2005, Svekla met 36-year-old Theresa Innes, who was also addicted to crack cocaine. She was a mother of 2 and talked about cleaning up her life, but never did. When the RCMP questioned him about Innes, he denies he was ever involved with her, but multiple witnesses at his trial told a different story. By winter of 2005, people around High Level noticed Theresa was missing. The last time anyone remembered seeing her alive was in early September, and life was further deteriorating for Svekla. He was fired from his job at Fountain Tire in February of 2006 and charged with multiple offenses. First, he was charged with assaulting 2 men, and then he was charged with committing an indecent act in the high-level jail. Apparently, he was masturbating while using the telephone, although Tom denies this and said he was just tucking his shirt into his pants. At the start of March 2006, Tom was in jail again for parole violations. He was released 2 months later on May 4th, and Svekla left for Edmonton that day, taking with him a black Winwell hockey bag. He told his ride that the bag contained 800 composting worms, worth $1 apiece, and that he was hauling them for a breeder friend. And he told the same story to his parents when he arrived in Fort Saskatchewan. The truth was, inside the bag was the body of Theresa Innes. Svekla's final undoing occurred because his sister Donna couldn't believe anyone would trust her delinquent brother with $800 worth of composting worms. So, on Sunday, May 7th, she and her husband inspected the bag. When she realized there was a body inside that was wrapped in garbage bags and an air mattress and a shower curtain and secured with wire, she called the RCMP, and 38-year-old Tom Svekla was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and interfering with a corpse. Svekla talked to the police for hours after his arrest. He always maintained he never knew Theresa, and that he simply found an unknown body in his truck when he got out of jail. But he had trouble getting his story straight, as he spun his various lies. He alluded to the involvement of other people, but named no one, saying that there were killers and dumpers and that he was just transporting a body and that he panicked because of Rachel Quinney, and that he knew he was again going to be considered a suspect. However, he was also confident during his interrogation, often joking with the officers, even daring them to charge him with Quinney's murder and the killings of 14 other women. And when the investigators asked why 14 was the magic number, he said he would be getting $14 million if he was falsely convicted. While he was in jail, he enjoyed bragging about himself, writing letters to friends, saying he was a popular man in jail, and said that the other inmates and guards sought him out for conversation. He bragged to his sister that lawyers were pounding down the door to take his case, and that other inmates put him in the same leagues as Canada's most notorious killers, referring to himself as the Pickton of Alberta, a reference to serial killer Robert Pickton, who murdered 49 women in British Columbia. And he blamed all of his problems on women. Yet, for all of his bragging, Svekla was often anxious while he awaited trial. Coincidentally enough, after he had been in jail for some time, no more sex workers had gone missing. Considering he was facing multiple murder charges, Tom Svekla was exceptionally positive for his first court hearing. Honestly, his behavior kind of reminds me of Ted Bundy. Thomas Svekla calls it the gesture that made him famous. On May 11, 2006, 4 days after the RCMP found the body of Theresa Innes wrapped in a cocoon of plastic and wires stored in a hockey bag, he made his first public appearance. Prison guards led him in and out of Fort Saskatchewan's provincial court for his perp walk, and a mass of news media cameras focused in on him. Under usual circumstances, most photographers struggle to get a usable photograph because most accused people duck and hide their faces. But not Svekla. When he came out, he looked right at the cameras, stopped, held up his index finger to his mouth, and went, "Shh," a gesture he said he borrowed from Christopher Walken's 1986 film At Close Range. The image appeared in newspapers and televised broadcasts across Canada. He told a reporter with the Edmonton Journal he couldn't believe the cops charged him with murder. He was laughing because he thought it was ridiculous. At his first appearance in Fort Saskatchewan's provincial court, he grinned and waved and gave the thumbs up to reporters. And when he later stood in the prisoner's box to hear the charges, he bounced up and down on his feet and stared up at the ceiling. He was facing second-degree murder charges in the death of Theresa Innes, as well as being investigated for multiple more. Svekla was the first Project KARE arrest, and at this point the task force wouldn't confirm if he had been linked to other deaths. Shortly after his arrest, a memorial service was held for Edmonton sex trade workers who had been killed. Over 200 people attended, including the family of Theresa Innes. Her mother, Beverly Innes, said it meant a lot that so many people came and shared the truth, that her daughter was more than just a sex worker. She was a sweet, giving person that helped others. Chad Quigley, Theresa's common-law husband for 11 years, said street drugs caused her downfall, and that their relationship was happy until the drugs took over. After his arrest, Svekla gave numerous interviews with the Edmonton Journal, mainly about Project KARE's investigation into his past. He insisted that he had nothing against the women, and maintained that Project KARE unfairly targeted him as a suspect, after he reported finding Rachel Quinney's body 2 years previously. He still insisted that he found Innes's body in his truck, but didn't kill her. 2007 didn't start out on a positive note for Tom. He will be charged with second-degree murder on January 2nd for the killing of Rachel Quinney. This was also the first time the RCMP admitted they possibly caught a serial killer who preyed on sex workers. He would plead not guilty to all the charges. In one weird twist, the Crown prosecutors subpoenaed 2 reporters who worked for the Edmonton Journal because of interviews conducted with Svekla through letters and phone calls while he was in the Edmonton Remand Center. The newspaper obviously fought the subpoenas, arguing in a separate motion that compelling journalists to testify can have an adverse effect on their jobs, and said that future reporting efforts might be hindered if journalists are seen as agents of the state. Incredibly, the judge sided with the Crown and said that the 2 reporters would have to testify at the preliminary hearing, and also said the potential evidence was important enough to outweigh any other factors. At Svekla's preliminary hearing on February 8, 2007, Judge Douglas Ray ruled after 5 weeks of testimony that Thomas Svekla would stand trial for the killings of both women. 83 witnesses testified at the preliminary hearing, and more were expected at the upcoming trial. Tom decided he had the best chance of beating the charges by avoiding a jury trial and having a judge alone decide his case. And one of the additional assault charges he was facing ended up being stayed in September of 2007 due to sloppy police work, the evidence apparently went missing. Thomas Svekla's murder trial began on February 19, 2008. He pled not guilty, and Crown Prosecutor Ashley Finlayson presented the state's case. Representing Svekla was Robert Pickton. In the opening days of the trial, disturbing photos of Rachel Quinney's mutilated body were presented, as well as photos of the hockey bag in which Theresa Innes' body was found. One witness, Brad Ludwig, testified that Svekla called him and told him that he found the body of a young woman in a field outside of Edmonton. And Svekla's sister testified about the day she and her husband found the body in the hockey bag. She had spent the day obsessed with what was in the bag. When she and her husband finally looked at the wrapped object inside, she had to convince him of what they were looking at. Police taped a phone call that Svekla made to his sister. And on this call, Svekla claimed that he was being set up and compared being caught with a dead body to being caught with stolen property. He then apparently changed his story and said he found Theresa's body in the back of his pickup truck and stuffed it in his hockey bag and hauled it to Edmonton. Svekla's mother testified that while Theresa's body was decaying in the hockey bag, he ran some errands, shopped for groceries, and went to his sister's place for a wiener roast. Alice Nalsnick and her husband Les, the couple who gave Svekla a ride to Fort Saskatchewan from High Level, also testified. They unfortunately had unknowingly transported Theresa Innes' body in the back of their pickup truck that day. During the 700-kilometer drive, the topic of Rachel Quinney's body came up after Alice commented on the roadkill on the highways. That's a little random. Apparently, she said, quote, "Boy, those crows sure eat well. They have steak in the morning and ribs at night." To which Tom replied, "Speaking of ribs, I've got a story to tell." And she said Svekla was excited to tell her the story of finding Quinney's body, and said that the body was placed among the trees that were not broken or twisted, and that it must have taken 2 men to move her. And Les Nalsnick testified that he saw Svekla drag the heavy hockey bag over to his truck, and that the bag contained 800 breeding earthworms that he could sell for $1 apiece. When his wife asked to see the worms, Svekla told her that the bag had to stay sealed. Svekla's former landlord in High Level testified that they found bloodstains on the carpet, on the door handles, and in the tub when he moved out a few months later. However, the cause of the stains could not be confirmed by forensic tests. She also saw a freezer in his apartment and couldn't fathom why it was there, especially when he was low on money. The court heard that Theresa Innes' body was cold to touch when it was discovered in the hockey bag, and a police affidavit entered into evidence suggested it might have been frozen. The medical examiner who testified also agreed it was possible Innes' body was kept frozen for months before it was moved. After 6 months and more than 100 witnesses, the Crown prosecutor closed their case against Thomas Svekla. The defense would call no evidence. The case then went to Justice Sterling Sanderman, who rendered his verdict on June 3, 2008, and ruled that Thomas Svekla was guilty of the second-degree murder of Theresa Innes and not guilty of the second-degree murder of Rachel Quinney, saying that there was no evidence to link him to her death, and that the medical examiner could not rule out the possibility that Quinney died from a drug overdose. Justice Sanderman rejected Svekla's claim that he only found the elaborately wrapped body in his truck, calling the explanation fanciful and ridiculous. He would sentence Svekla to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 17 years. But this is not the end of the story. He filed an appeal to his murder conviction, as well as he still had sexual assault charges and uttering death threats to face in High Level. He opted for another trial by judge instead of a jury, and on September 8, 2008, Justice Christine Eidsvik found him guilty of both sexually assaulting a woman and threatening to kill her after inviting her back to his place. It was also announced at this time that the Crown would seek a dangerous offender designation for Thomas Svekla. Canada doesn't have life without the possibility of parole as a sentencing option, but the Crown does have the option to petition the court for dangerous offender status, and they must show that there is a high risk that the criminal will commit violent or sexual offenses in the future. This designation is reserved for the worst of the worst, Canada's most violent criminals and sexual predators. Examples of infamous dangerous offenders include the Scarborough rapist Paul Bernardo and the now deceased Beast of British Columbia Clifford Olson. The designation carries an automatic sentence of imprisonment for an indeterminate period. Dangerous offenders can apply for parole after 7 years, but the indeterminate sentence usually equals a life sentence. Currently, there are 860 inmates designated as dangerous offenders under the responsibility of Correctional Services Canada. In March of 2009, Svekla would go on trial yet again, this time for charges stemming back to 1995, when he sexually abused M's former foster child. She had lived with M for 6 months, after which she was moved to another foster home for 6 more months. Following that, she moved in with her uncle and grandmother and told them she had been abused. The grandmother then called the police. Lance Steele, a retired Edmonton detective, investigated the allegations against Svekla in 1996, but closed the file without recommending charges. When questioned by the Crown, he said he had no specific memory of the case. Interviews, statements, and videotape evidence from the file had gone missing by the time of his 2009 trial. However, the judge was convinced of Svekla's guilt and convicted him for the 1995 offenses. In January of 2010, Ashley Finlayson delivered her closing argument at Thomas Svekla's dangerous offender hearing. She summarized evidence that included testimony from 4 women, including ex-girlfriends and former friends, who all testified that Svekla attacked them. Finlayson argued that each of these attacks occurred suddenly and demonstrated that Svekla could not control his sexual impulses. And on May 28, 2010, a convicted murderer who once called himself the Boogeyman would be locked up indefinitely. It took 1 hour for Justice Christine Eidsvik to read her decision and detail Svekla's crimes, which have created victims across the province of Alberta, including young girls, former girlfriends, and the women he was convicted of murdering. In the aftermath of this case, there are still a ton of unanswered questions. The unsolved Project KARE homicide cases remain open, and the RCMP now won't comment specifically on or about Svekla, even though back in 2006, he was originally considered the prime suspect in all these unsolved murders. He remains a suspect in other cases, but legally speaking, although he behaves like a serial killer, we can't really call him that. It would certainly be easier if Svekla actually was the boogeyman and was responsible for all of these murders. But the terrifying reality is that there is more than one murderer hunting women on the streets of Edmonton. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to hang out with me today. Let me know your thoughts down below on this incredibly disturbing case, and let me know if there's a case you would like me to cover. If you'd like to support my channel, you can go to Buy Me a Coffee if you'd like to donate. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.